Hi, COMM students. I'm Michelle. I'm one of the Cabrillo librarians, and we're going to work on finding news sources for your informative speech today. So we're going to be looking at Google News and the library newspaper database, ProQuest National Newspapers and CLASS. We'll talk more about the difference between these two, but I wanted to start by talking a little bit about fact-checking. And before we do that, just a reminder, you can submit questions about research or anything else through Ask a Librarian, and you can access all our resources 24/7 using your Canvas login and password. So, how do you guys fact check information you find online? I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the strategies I use as a librarian, and then ask you to think about what are some of the strategies you use to fact check information. So I'm going to move over here. And so with this question, how can we fact check that this news story shared with me is true? So one of the first things I do as a librarian is just see if anybody else has fact checked this story. There's a lot of fact checking organizations. So I will just go to Google, type in the story and add the words fact check and see if anybody else has done that work for me. Here you can see about 5 articles come up right off the bat from Snopes, Fact Check, New York Times, BBC, and they've already kind of looked into all those citations, where it came from, and told me a lot about where this story is and what kind of evidence they're using. Another thing people do when researching is just try to figure out, is any other news organization reporting on this story? If it's only one news organization, if it's only news organizations from a particular political perspective, that would make me skeptical about the story. So again, I went to Google, but this time I switched over to Google News that just searches newspaper articles, typed in a description of the story to see what came up and what kind of newspapers are reporting on this story. And I'm really trying to find the best source I can so I can be a good informative speaker. Another strategy for trying to figure out what's up with the newspaper and whether you think it's a credible source is just to look it up online, see what their reputation is in the greater world. And Wikipedia is usually a good source to kind of situate an article, a publisher or a newspaper. So in this case, I looked it up. The newspaper was Vox. I found an article on Wikipedia that told me a little bit about like how long they've been around, how many readers they have. It also told me that they're kind of a liberal, left-leaning newspaper, so that's helpful to know. That's their perspective. And it told me that they have won awards for their journalism, so it's a legitimate source with a particular perspective. So context is super important when you're trying to figure out whether a source is legit. Some newspaper stories are straight up made up and false, but more often it's just information taken out of context. So one example of that is this report on an unstoppable flu, which seems like it's maybe related to what's happening to us now, but it's actually a newspaper article from about 10 years ago on a whole other flu and a whole other epidemic. So figuring out when this information was published, where it's coming from, giving it some context. Another part of context is who wrote it and whether you consider them a good source on this topic. Again, who the expert on this topic is totally going to depend on what you're researching. Is it how to make a pie or whether to get the flu vaccine, right? So think about your topic and who you consider to be experts on this topic. With newspapers and other sources, you can look up the publisher and figure out kind of what their reputation is, like we did with Vox. When you're looking at social media posts, you can hover over the name and try to get a little more information about who this person is. In this case, this is the information they have about who they are, and based on that, I would not use them as a source for what's happening in China with the coronavirus. Similarly with pictures, you can try to put them in context. This is a image that's been photoshopped, and you can do a reverse search in Google, or even just type in a description of the picture in Google and try to figure out where this image is coming from. Going back again to the idea of who you consider an expert on your topic, this is a guy who, again, it's not false, like deliberately misleading information. He's a reporter. He's, a meteorologist, a guy who lives in Sacramento, just reporting on his perspective. But if I was trying to find, the best source on my topic, I might pick someone else. Like, for example, this reporter who is not focusing specifically on weather. They're not a meteorologist. They're doing more general reporting, and they've won some awards for their reporting. So again, try to think about how do you kind of suss out information? How do you judge whether a source is credible and whether it's really the best source for the topic you're researching? And remember, if you get stuck, you can always use Ask a Librarian, either submitting a question form or chatting with the librarian when we're open to find sources, evaluate sources, get any kind of help for whatever assignment you're working on.